Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 18th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific to understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Last time, we spent a lot of time in India, including briefly covering the spectacular and mysterious Indus Valley civilization, the migration of the Indo-Aryans, the origins of Brahmanism and Buddhism, the rise of Chandragupta Maurya and his genius advisor and mentor Chanakya, the ouster of the Greco-Macedonians, and the establishment of the Mauryan Empire. As we closed, Chandragupta had abdicated his throne in favor of his son Bindusara, adopted the life of an ascetic, and fasted himself to death. Whoa, that was a lot. 3,000 years of history, give or take. Today, we will finally introduce Ashoka the Great, considered by many to be the greatest ruler in India's long and splendid history, whose iconography can even be found on the modern country's flag. In our last episode, I promised that we wouldn't spend too much time on Ashoka's dad, Bindusara, before getting to the main focus of this episode. There's a very good reason for this. We just don't know all that much about the guy. A lot of the sources say that he led a peaceful kingdom, that Chandragupta had done all the conquering, set up the sophisticated apparatus of government, then just turned things over to Bindusara, who managed to keep the train on the tracks. We know the approximate dates of his reign from 297 BCE to 273 BCE. We know his name, we know his father and at least one of his sons, but aside from that, there's a lot of conjecture. In some sources, however, it is claimed that the final conquest of much of southern peninsula of India was not accomplished by Chandragupta, but instead by Bindusara. In this interpretation, Bindusara was more than just a guy who kept the seat warm for his talented son. Rather, if he was indeed a conqueror, he showed that the urge to keep fighting, subjugating, expanding was indeed in the family blood. This makes sense for three reasons. One, the events of Chandragupta's life were so dramatic, so chock full of getting stuff done, that it seems reasonable to think that maybe there wasn't quite enough time to do all these spectacular things in the time available to him. Therefore, maybe his son actually did some of the things for which Chandragupta got credit. The other is that Bindusara had a name that meant something akin to slayer of enemies or devourer of enemies. That doesn't quite seem like the moniker of someone who ruled with peace and gentility for a quarter century. So maybe it was Bindusara who conquered the kingdoms in the southwest of the subcontinent. Who knows? The third reason is that only during the reign of King Bindusara did the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, another of the breakaway successor kingdoms in the post-Alexandrian partition of empire, sent an empire to the Mauryan court. This signaled a rise in status of the empire to the rest of the world and could further indicate that Bindusara did more than just take over from his dad and keep the seat warm for his son. But again, who knows? There does seem to be one other thing we can say about the guy with reasonable certainty. He had a lot of wives, perhaps 16, and many more concubines besides, and with these women he sired a lot of children. You may recall that one of Chandragupta's innovations was to divide his kingdom into provinces and then place a prince in charge and pair that prince with a seasoned administrator. In this, Chandragupta was populating the provinces with ruling pairs similar to the structure of his relationship with the great prime minister and political theorist Chanakya. As the empire got bigger, there were more and more provinces. In order to keep it all in the family, the king needed a lot of sons. And in this, it is certain that Bindusara was a success. Whether it was through expanding, by conquest, or peacefully administering the kingdom won by Chandragupta, or a combination of both, the Mauryan Empire continued to thrive and develop under Bindusara. How much of this can be attributed to the king is uncertain, for he had the great benefit of having Chanakya at his side, just as his father had. The dates of Chanakya's birth and death are the subject of a lot of speculation, with birth dates ranging from 375 BCE to 350 BCE, and his death from 283 BCE to 275 BCE. He either died in his mid-70s or his early 90s. Either way, he lived a long time for his age and had a dramatic impact on the Mauryan dynasty and on Indian history. No matter when Chanakya died, he did so before Bindusara chose a successor. The prolific king had a lot of options, something along the lines of 100 sons with his wives and concubines. If we figure that there is likely about one girl for every boy born to the king, this would mean that Bindusara had nearly 200 kids, and if he only sired children with his wives, then each of these ladies would have averaged about 13 kids each. Even if he had another 16 concubines to complement his 16 wives, this would mean he fathered more than 6 kids with each woman. They must have been exhausted. This is some Ramses II stuff right here. But unlike Ramses, there wouldn't be any elaborate tombs for these progeny, because most of them are going to die quickly and violently. Of course, only one of these 100 sons could succeed Bindusara to head the Mauryan Empire. The young prince that would one day rise to become Ashoka the Great was born around 305 BCE, but little would indicate that the young prince would rise to greatness. Well, aside from the firm conviction of his mother that he was meant for great things. There's much uncertainty over the birth and parentage of Ashoka. I mean, we know who the father is. Sorry, Maury Povich. But the exact name and background of the prince's mother remains uncertain. One tradition has her as the daughter of a Brahmin, the elites from the priestly caste of the Brahminical religion. The girl was prophesied to marry a king and bear 2 sons, one of whom would be a great king, the other a great religious teacher. Pleased with this prophecy, her father offered her to Bindusara, who accepted her into his harem. She was a woman of unsurpassed beauty and became the object of jealousy from the other royal wives and concubines. These women conspired to prevent her from sleeping with the king and to relegate her to the role of a barber. But when she cut Bindusara's hair, he was so smitten with her, he told her that he would grant her one wish. She requested to sleep with the king, which he was all too eager to do. There was a problem, though. How could a great king sleep with a lowly barber? She revealed to Bindusara that she was actually of the Brahmin caste, and into bed they hopped. Afterward, he was so taken with her that he made her his chief royal wife. But this is just one story among many. We don't even know her name. Some sources call her Dama, others call her Dharma, still others call her Subhadranji. Most say Dama, and, as we will see, the concept of Dhamma, from which the name was derived, would also loom large for Ashoka, so that's what we're going to go with from here on out. By now, you're probably noticing how many times I've pointed out that the sources conflict on key points about our subjects and the events of their lives. At any point, either in the first part of this episode, have you wondered how there can be so many conflicting sources about the same people? The central reason for this is that there are numerous traditions that describe their lives and careers. There's a Jainist tradition, a Buddhist tradition, traditions specific to different regions like Kashmir and Tibet. There are ancient plays that draw out the works of our protagonists. There are local and regional legends that have been passed down. Our challenge with Sargon, the first episode in this series, is the paucity of sources from which to build a narrative. With Chandragupta, Ashoka, the Buddha, etc., the issue is not a lack of sources, but rather, relatively speaking, an abundance of them. One of the key challenges that scholars have to contend with is interpreting all these different stories. The conventional narratives of Chandragupta, Chanakya, Bindusara, and Ashoka seem to be, for lack of a better term, distilled averages across these different sources. There's a lot to comb through, and it's likely that many of the traditions that survived were established to reinforce a specific interpretation of history and cosmology specific to different faiths in different regions. Some of these interpretations have changed over time. Others were written down centuries later. Still others are contained within lost or poorly understood languages. There's a lot of ongoing scholarship to try to untangle all of these intersecting and often competing versions of events. Suffice to say, it's all complicated, but that's what makes it fun. I say this to remind you, as always, there's a massive body of scholarship that awaits anyone nerdy enough to jump in with both feet. I'm pausing to say all this here because no one, and I mean no one that we encounter in this series, has more conflicting stories and legends than Ashoka, and since he's about to be born, I wanted to insert the appropriate asterisk. But let's get back to our story, or one version of the story. In her new position as queen, Dama enjoyed learning of the prophecy that she was destined to have 2 sons. One would rise to become a great king, the other a renowned religious leader. Entrenched in her position as royal wife, Dama did indeed give birth to 2 sons. The first she named Ashoka, which meant without sorrow. Her second son she named Vitashoka, which meant the end of sorrow. Now, I know you're going to be shocked to hear this, but we don't actually know when Ashoka was born. It seems like he was toward, but not at the top of the birth order, making him one of the older sons of Bindusara. For once, sources seem to agree that he did have an older brother with a stronger claim to the throne. To complicate matters for Ashoka, it would appear that his father didn't particularly care for him. Various accounts say the king disliked Ashoka's skin, which was rough, malodorous, and unpleasant to the touch. But these same accounts also suggest that Ashoka was given key responsibilities, such as leading a campaign to suppress a revolt in Taxila, one of the provincial territories, at the tender age of 18. In this early test, Ashoka was greatly successful. The rebels laid down their arms without a fight, claiming that their gripe was not with the king, but with the local administrators, and now that they had the imperial administration's attention, they were satisfied. Ashoka treated the rebels magnanimously, avoiding bloodshed and retribution. He heard their complaints and peacefully resolved the dispute. From there, Bindusara sent Ashoka to govern a key commercial hub, giving the young prince important economic experience to accompany his military training. While in this province, Ashoka got training of a different kind. He met, fell in love with, and married a local woman named Devi. She was the daughter of a local merchant and of non-royal lineage. Devi offered no advantage in terms of political connections. Unlike most royal weddings of the time, Ashoka married Devi for love, and the two had a close connection. Devi quickly bore Ashoka 2 children, his oldest son, Mahendra, born around 285 BCE, and his daughter, Sanghamitra, born around 282 BCE. Devi was, apparently, Buddhist, and her closeness to the prince gave him exposure to that faith. Given Devi's common status, Ashoka would need to augment his household with wives of more pedigree. While Ashoka was on assignment off in the provinces, Taxila rose up in revolt again. This time, Bindusara dispatched his oldest son and crown prince, Ashoka's half-brother, Susima, to put down the revolt. But Susima was not as successful at subduing the troublemakers, and he fell into a bloody campaign of suppression, which may have lasted a couple years. As all this was going on, Bindusara fell sick. It quickly became apparent that he was not long for this life, and all of a sudden the Mauryan throne was likely to be up for grabs. Bindusara sent for Susima, but the crown prince was bogged down in the ongoing conflict with Taxila and struggled to extricate himself. Seeking an opportunity to make his own bid for power, Ashoka rushed to the palace and arrived before Susima could untangle himself from the roiling revolt in Taxila. Ashoka beat his half-brother to the palace. Having won the race, Ashoka made his power play, laying claim to the Mauryan throne and seeking to disinherit his brother, who had been Bindusara's chosen successor. Ambitious and well-schooled in economics and warfare, Ashoka was a capable man in his early to mid-30s. He was just neither the oldest nor the chosen successor. Ashoka did have one huge advantage over his half-brother. The palace advisors preferred him. Years earlier, Susima had struck one of the senior courtiers. Embarrassed and seething with a desire for revenge, the advisor had plotted a scheme to refuse support for Susima and to shift it to Ashoka. He recruited 500 fellow administrators, bureaucrats, and generals to join in the conspiracy. With the aged Bindusara fading out, the imperial retainers put their long-dormant plan into action. Bindusara died in 273 BCE at age 46 or 47. At the crucial moment, this cabal of administrators and courtly retainers refused to recognize Susima and declared their support for the younger half-brother. Susima was not thrilled with the development, feeling that as the eldest and as Bindusara's chosen successor, the throne was rightly his. But Ashoka's power grab had left Susima on the back foot, and the younger brother quickly took steps to eliminate the older. With the support of the palace advisors, Ashoka had his brother tracked down and seized. With his rival to the throne in custody, Ashoka wasted little time in having his older brother eliminated. He executed his brother in horrific fashion when he ordered that Susima be thrown alive into a charcoal fire pit where he was slowly and excruciatingly roasted to death. This cruelty was a bad sign that Ashoka might be prone to abuse of power in horrific ways. Much worse was to come. At this point, Ashoka, as one of the eldest sons of Bindusara and having had the backing of the imperial administration, he likely had a pretty firm grip on power. But he either did not feel secure on the throne or just didn't want to leave anything to chance. You may recall that Bindusara was extremely prolific, having sired approximately 100 sons and presumably as many daughters. Bindusara was in Ramses II territory when it came to having children. With Susima dead, that meant that there was one brother down and 99 to go. Bent on eliminating anyone and everyone that could potentially pose a threat to his rule, Ashoka then unleashed a reign of terror aimed at purging all of the other royal princes. Every one of these scores of brothers was a potential rival to power. Not content to sit back and accept their violent death at the hands of the usurping brother, many of the sons of Bindusara rose up to try to claim the throne for themselves. Violence and bloodshed erupted across the empire. Ashoka's seizure of the crown and vicious execution of Susima had unleashed a violent civil war. He might have had all the imperial retainers in his camp, but there were a lot of royal princes. In order to pull off his violent seizure and consolidation of power, Ashoka had a lot of blood to spill. One by one, all of these brothers were tracked down and slaughtered, murdered in their palaces, defeated in battle, or betrayed by a courtly retainer anxious to curry favor with the ascendant Ashoka, who careened across the empire, fighting, killing, plotting. Ashoka's troops and assassins were relentless and remorseless. Every single one of Ashoka's 100 or so brothers were liquidated, whether they contested his accession or not. There was one sole exception. Ashoka's younger full brother made the supremely smart decision to renounce all claims to the throne and opted for life as a Buddhist monk. The prophecy Queen Dama had received before the boys were born, that one would rise to be a great king and the other to be a great religious leader, was well on its way to being realized. It appears that it took Ashoka 4 or 5 years to win the bloody contest for the crown and murder all of his brothers. This interpretation of events is due to a 4-year gap between his bid for power and his formal consecration as king. In 270 BCE, amidst this ongoing and bloody purge, Ashoka did take the time to marry again, wedding Asandamitra, a woman of high status. Unlike Devi, Ashoka's first wife, Asandamitra was of elevated enough station to be considered worthy of being an empress. In time, she would become his great queen, the ranking of the household that would eventually include 5 wives. As with Devi, the relationship with Ashoka and Asandamitra seems to have been intimate, and she was referred to as his beloved. He also seems to have trusted her judgment and intelligence. Sources suggest that she became a close counselor to Ashoka, offering her advice as he navigated the challenges of rule. After those long, bloody years, Ashoka had eliminated all of his rivals, both real and imagined, and he was fully and formally invested as king. He sat on a throne stained with the blood of his own brothers. But sit on that throne he did, and he loved it, but for all the wrong reasons. Once fully in power, unchecked and unfettered, Ashoka indulged in all the trappings of being king of a mighty empire. He, it turns out, was lustful, cruel, and sadistic. In particular, he delighted in the absolute power that came with being king, and with it his ability to cow, humiliate, torture, or kill anyone for any reason. He took great pleasure in the torture and killing of those that displeased him. Justice was arbitrary and cruel. For example, he's reputed to have built an elaborate pleasure palace, complete with gardens, ambulatories, flowers, and fountains. Prisoners would be sent there as they waited for Ashoka's judgment. But the initial appearance of the palace was a cruel diversion, meant to lull the prisoners into a false sense of hope and serenity. Its basement level was full of torture chambers, each filled with insidious devices to inflict maximum pain and suffering on all condemned to experience its horrors, including pouring molten metal down the throats of horrified prisoners. Allegedly, the Palace of Torture was designed to reflect the 5 horrors of the Buddhist hell, but there's nothing holy about this place. It was a pure expression of sadism. One didn't even need to have been convicted or even suspected of crime to be sent to what became known as Ashoka's Hell. Whenever the supply of prisoners ran low, unlucky subjects were snatched up and subjected to its torments, all to keep the king amused with the unrelenting torture. Pain wasn't Ashoka's only pleasure. He also built an extensive harem of 500 women. Being his concubine was not a pleasant experience for the women. In addition to his streak of cruelty and sadism, he still had that rough and malodorous skin that his father had disliked so much. Many of the concubines came to loathe Ashoka. But he wasn't without aesthetic sensibilities. He enjoyed nature and was particularly taken with a certain Ashoka tree. Not only was the tree beautiful, but they shared a name. His love of this tree became known among his inner circle. His concubines, or we suspect a few of his particularly disaffected concubines, decided to extract a measure of anonymous revenge on Ashoka. When no one else was around, They snuck off to his favorite tree, and they scarred and sliced and diced its bark so that the tree would have the same rough skin that they had to endure in the harem. If they felt a bit of smug satisfaction in their actions, it wouldn't last long. When Ashoka found out about the tree, he was enraged. It was an affront both to nature and to his royal dignity. When he found out who had committed the act, he was apoplectic. He had all 500 women of his harem rounded up, whether they were involved in the mutilation of the tree or not. He then had them all, every last one, burnt alive. To him, 500 women were easier to replace than one tree. The ministers that had helped install Ashoka on the throne began to have their doubts. After all, they disliked Susima because in a rash act he had struck one of the retainers. Ashoka was proving to be far, far worse than his older brother. But Ashoka was perceptive. He grew suspicious of their loyalties and decided to put them to the test. The king began issuing all sorts of ridiculous and farcical orders to test the obedience of his inner circle. Certain that fulfilling these absurd commands would have disastrous consequences, the ministers equivocated. When they failed to unquestionably perform these tasks, Ashoka judged them to be disloyal. As he had with the poor women of his harem, Ashoka had them all seized and put to the sword, commanding that each have their heads lopped off. Another 500 victims sacrificed to the women ego of a sadistic king. He was racking up quite the body count. But Ashoka didn't sit around in his palaces all day, torturing people here and mass murdering people there. He took his show of horrors out on the road, bent on conquest by any means necessary. By the time Ashoka seized the throne, the Mauryan Empire encompassed almost all of India, with two noted exceptions. At the very south, the tip of the subcontinent and the island that is today Sri Lanka remained outside of Mauryan control. And on the east coast of India, the proud and independent kingdom of Kalinga stubbornly held onto their turf. Skilled traders and artisans, the Kalinga had developed a robust seafaring trade whose network radiated out all over southern Asia. Their rich and beautiful kingdom was a tempting prize for the covetous Ashoka. The unlucky Kalinga must have felt trepidation as Ashoka mobilized for war, bent on conquering their kingdom and adding it to his extensive dominions. In or around the 7th year of his reign, Ashoka came calling. Given Ashoka's reputation for bloodthirstiness, the Kalinga knew that a fight with Ashoka was a life or death proposition, and they fought for their very survival. Though Kalinga was much smaller than the Mauryan Empire, their economic productivity had brought a lot of wealth to their kingdom. As such, they had a well-funded and sophisticated military and could marshal considerable battlefield resources. In around 261 BCE, the two kingdoms clashed. For a year, Ashoka slugged it out with the Kalinga. The Kalingans had been right to be gripped by fear over the fight with Ashoka. The war of conquest was apocalyptic for them. 100,000 Kalingans were killed in the brutal fighting. Another 150,000 were captured and deported for a life of slavery. Ashoka had conquered his smaller neighbor, but at the cost of incalculable suffering and loss of life. But to this point, such trifling things had mattered not a bit to the cruel Mauryan king. As long as he got what he wanted, nothing else mattered. I suspect at this point you are wondering why Ashoka is called the Great. There is nothing great about him to this point. His reign was blood-soaked. So far as we've seen, he was pretty terrible. Torture, execution, warfare, cruelty, sadism. No one was safe around this guy. Friends, retainers, family, common citizens, foreigners, they were all subject to the cruel fates indeed, and at Ashoka's hands. So if you're starting to ask yourself, when does this guy become great? Then that's a very fair question. But the answer, as it turns out, is that Ashoka is about to take a big pivot toward his greatness right now. Surveying the battlefield that completed the conquest of Kalinga, Ashoka finally opened his eyes to the true toll of war. All the suffering, all the lives lost, all the butchered bodies of fallen soldiers, arms, legs, heads missing, the soil swollen with the blood of the dead. Seeing this all at once began to change Ashoka. And rather than revel in the gore, something happened to him. He was utterly and completely repulsed, not only at what he saw, but also his role in bringing it to fruition. The effects of the Kalinga War shook Ashoka to his core. It ate at his conscience. It made him question all the death, the killing, the suffering. In gaining the throne and in his first few years as king, he had slaughtered and tortured so many. Surveying the battlefield and contemplating his role in bringing about so much death, he resolved that there could be no more such horrors. No more killing. No more torture. No more executions. Well, except for one. Returning home, Ashoka had the executioner that ran Ashoka's hell, that insidious palace of cruel and sadistic torture, dispatched. He then ordered the place razed to the ground so that no trace of it would remain. After this one last execution, he resolved that from then on he would be a man of peace, of kindness, of justice. He'd had a revelation, and now that he had a lot of sins for which he needed to atone, there was no time to waste. He buried the hatchet. Literally, he committed himself to the rule of benevolence, duty to his people, and the promulgation of peace and justice everywhere. This commitment was more than a personal code of conduct. Reflecting on the magnitude of the pain and suffering he had brought about before his awakening, Ashoka was gripped with a searing sense of obligation to not only change his behavior, but also to atone for it. Ashoka began to formulate a personal sense of duty or obligation. Building on existing traditions, he promoted his commitment to and the promulgation of the concept of Dhamma. The term is tough to define. It means truth, obligation, justice, righteousness, good behavior, and so on. It was less a word and more of a system of behavior and ethics. But while it defies easy translation, Ashoka left little doubt about its importance, his commitment to it, and the need of his subjects to understand his newfound piety. Communicating this newfound piety and his commitment to peace and justice was important. Ashoka had his words and policies carved in rock all over the kingdom so that any passerby could read them and take his heart to message. In all these carvings, he reinforced his policy of Dhamma, what it meant and why it was so central to his belief structures. All over the kingdom, Ashoka promoted his policy of Dhamma. It became part and parcel of his rule. Dhamma was his policy, and his policy was Dhamma, all carved in stone across his dominions for all people to see. Ashoka brought his voice directly to his people. In these carvings, we find an example of cross-cultural exchange in which Ashoka incorporated ideas from other people and made them his own. In particular, the style of rock-carved royal inscriptions and the style and usage of language were derived from the Achaemenid Persians. These rock edicts, as they are now called, represent some of the best sources of information we have about Ashoka and his reign. They offered great clues about the king, his values, his commitment to Dhamma, etc. The rock edicts also give us a tantalizing glance of the cultural exchange happening at the time. But the Persian influence went beyond the usage of rock-carved inscriptions. Another way these great cultures influenced another was in architecture, with Ashoka adopting Persian-style monuments and palaces. Alexander might have toppled the Achaemenids, but Ashoka was certainly keeping aspects of their culture and civilization alive and well. Considering his imperial proclamations, his adoption of artistic and architectural styles, his conversion, it seems, brought forth many changes in the aesthetic and policies of the Mauryan Empire. But more than anything, Ashoka's moral awakening impacted his spiritual stance, as that was, by far, where he spent the most time and energy. It's possible that, due to the influence of his wife Devi, Ashoka had nominally been a Buddhist before the Kalinga War. If so, it was only at a superficial level because there's a big gap between the tenets of Buddhism and the wholesale slaughter of a rival kingdom. But after the Kalinga War, and driven by his profound awakening, Ashoka committed deeply to Buddhism. In the episode on Darius the Great, we spent some time considering how unusual it was that Darius inscribed in rock the nature of the numerous revolts against him at the outset of his rule. He did this in large measure to emphasize the vigor with which he responded to these threats, and the thorough nature of his complete and total suppression of them. Ashoka likewise inscribed his own sins on rock. In his rock edicts, he detailed his own moral failings. Unlike Darius, who used this kind of imperial decree to emphasize his triumph over external threats, Ashoka's inscriptions describe his victory over his own moral shortcomings. He also expressed his regret over his actions and reinforced the depths of his sorrow. In one carving, Ashoka declared that he, quote, feels deep remorse for having conquered the Kalingas, and is deeply pained by the killing, dying, and deportation that take place when an unconquered country is conquered, close quote. In this edict, now called the 13th Rock Edict, Ashoka committed to sending missionaries all over the world to spread the Buddhist message and implores his sons and grandsons to eschew conquest in favor of peace and harmony. He sought to establish and maintain a pacifist empire based on respect for the sanctity of life. It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how it works out for him. And find out we will on the next episode, that is, as this is the point that we are going to pause for the week. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we conclude our look at Ashoka and follow his transition from evil and cruel despot to enlightened pacifist. He was on the road to becoming a much nicer guy, but would he truly become great?